The tarp split open at the Vale Draw gate. It happened in one hard gust. The kind Wyoming liked to throw across open land without warning. One moment. The wagon cover was holding over 4 sacks of flour, 2 grain bags, and a roll of new canvas. The next. The center seam gave way with a sound like cloth tearing under a knife. White flour dust lifted into the air. Jonah Vale pulled the team short. Behind him, the loose tin on the barn roof beat in the wind. Flat and hollow. The ranch gate leaned on one hinge. Beyond it, the yard looked tired in the afternoon light. A dry corral. A barn with boards silvered by weather. A bunkhouse that sat low like it had been waiting years for someone to lift it. Jonah stared at the torn tarp. "Of course," he said. Not loud. Not angry. Just a man naming one more thing he could not afford. The driver on the wagon seat swore under his breath. "Storm's coming west. I can see that. You got another cover." Jonah looked toward the barn. He had 3 covers. All bad. Before he could answer, a woman climbed down from the rear of the wagon. She wore a plain brown travel dress with dust at the hem, a dark hat pulled low, and a canvas roll strapped across her shoulder. She did not ask permission. She pulled the torn tarp edge toward her, set one knee against the wagon wheel, and opened the roll. Tools lay inside. Needles. Heavy shears. A pommel. Waxed thread wound tight around a black wooden spool. Brass grommets sorted into a small tin. Jonah watched her thread a needle with hands that did not hurry. "You'll lose the flour if that opens another foot," she said. The driver blinked. "Ma'am." She looked at Jonah. "Hold this edge down." Jonah moved before pride could slow him. The wind hit again. Flour stung his cheek. The woman leaned into the canvas, set the needle, and drove it through both torn layers with a steady push of the pommel. She did not make pretty stitches. She made deep ones. Angled and tight. Built to hold weight. The team shifted. The barn tin struck again. Jonah kept the tarp pinned while she worked. By the time the first cold drops of rain hit the dust, the split had been crossed with a temporary seam strong enough to get the wagon under cover. The flour sacks stayed dry. The grain bags held. The driver let out a breath. "Well, I'll be." The woman tied off the stitch, cut the thread with her teeth, and stood. Only then did Jonah notice her face properly. 30 or so. Maybe older. Hard to tell beneath the travel dust. Not soft. Not severe. Her eyes were gray and direct in a way that made careless talk feel expensive. "You're Mr. Vale?" she asked. "Yes. Maren Rowan." Jonah looked at the canvas roll. Then back at her. The agency letter sat in his coat pocket like a thing suddenly written by a stranger. "You're Miss Rowan." "I am. You were due in town. The driver said he was passing your road." I did not see the sense in waiting at a hotel if the wagon was coming here. That was practical. Jonah had asked for practical. He had written to the agency in April because Vale Draw was losing money through every crack a ranch could have. He needed mending. Cooking. Curtains, maybe. Some order in a house that had not felt kept in years. He had not written for romance. He had written like a man ordering a plow part. And he was not proud of that now. Maren looked toward the barn roof, where rain had started tapping on the loose tin. "You should get that under shelter," she said. "And that roof needs fixing before the next real storm." Jonah almost laughed. But it came out tired. "There are a lot of things need fixing. I saw that coming up the lane." The driver made a small sound. Wisely swallowed. Jonah studied hair. "Your letter said you did repair work." It said canvas and leather repair. Wagon covers. Harness. Tarpaulins. Grain sacks. Sailcloth. Before that, my letter mentioned curtains. I remember. She rolled her tools back with care. "I can make curtains. They will hang straight and keep weather out. They will not impress women who like lace. That is not a problem. I cook plain. Plain food keeps a man alive. I am not here to decorate your house." "Mr. Vale." "No. And I am not agreeing to be a wife before I know whether this arrangement has room for the work I actually do." The rain thickened. For a moment. Only the tarp snapped, and the team breathed. Jonah looked at the seam she had made. It was ugly in the way a brace on a broken gate was ugly. Useful. Honest. Meant to hold until a proper repair could be done. What I need, he said, is for things to stop falling apart faster than I can pay for them. Maren's face changed slightly. Not a smile. Recognition. Maybe. Then I should see your equipment before I see the parlor. We do not have much of a parlor. That saves time. This time. He did laugh once. Quiet and surprised. They drove the wagon under the barn overhang. As Jonah helped unload, Maren paused over the torn tarp and rubbed the old seam between her fingers. Her expression tightened. What is it? He asked. This thread is wrong. Wrong how? Too light for load canvas. It was never going to hold long. I bought that tarp patched from Ezra Kline in town. Maren looked toward the road they had come from, where rain blurred the ruts and Borden Creek sat beyond the low rise. Then Mr. Kline either does not know canvas, she said, or he knows it too well. The barn tin hammered above them. Jonah stood with flour on his sleeve and debt in his pocket, watching Maren Rowan fold the failed seam like evidence. For the first time in years, one of the broken things on Vale Draw had begun to speak. By first light, Maren Rowan had seen enough of Vale Draw to know the ranch was not dying from one wound. It was leaking out through 50 small ones. Jonah found her at the barn before breakfast, standing beside the freight wagon with her sleeves rolled back and her tool roll open on a crate. She had the torn tarp spread over the wagon bed, one hand pressed flat against the canvas, the other holding the failed seam up to the morning light. You start early, he said. So does damage. He looked at the tarp. Bad. Not ruined. She rubbed the thread between two fingers until it frayed apart. But this patch was never meant to hold load. It was dressed up to look like repair. Jonah's jaw tightened. Ezra Kline sold it as weather-ready. Then Ezra Kline sold you a promise with weak thread. Jonah said nothing, but his face told her the number had already entered his head. How much he had paid. How many other things he had bought from the same counter. How many small failures he had blamed on weather. Luck. Or his own poor management. Maren let him stand with that a moment. Then she pointed toward the storage loft. May I look at the rest? The rest of what? Everything that breaks, leaks, carries weight, or keeps weather out. That took most of the morning. The main wagon cover had 2 stress tiers hidden beneath dust. One grain sack leaked slow enough that no one had noticed the flour line along the barn floor. 3 harness straps were dry at the bend. A tent roll in the back stall had mouse damage along one edge. The bunkhouse door had been stuffed with feed cloth to keep the wind out, and the cloth had gone stiff with damp. Maren made marks in a small notebook. Not many words. Just item. Condition. Material needed. Urgency. Jonah followed it first. Arms crossed. Saying little. After the 5th item, he stopped looking defensive. After the 10th, he looked tired. By the time she showed him the grain sack leak, he leaned one shoulder against the stall post and stared at the floor, like it had been accusing him for years, and he had only just learned its language. How much? He asked. To replace all this. He nodded. Too much. He gave a humorless breath. That is a number I know. To repair most of it. She closed the notebook. Less than you think. But it needs proper thread. Oil. Canvas weight that matches. And time. Can you do it? I can do the work. Whether the ranch can stand still long enough for repair is another question. Vale Draw did not stand still. 6 hands came in and out of the barn before noon, each pretending not to study her. Hiram Cole, the oldest, watched openly from beside the black mare's stall. Elie Tabor, young and loose-limbed, looked guilty every time Maren touched an old patch. You stitched this? She asked him, holding up a section of feed sack sewn over canvas. Eli rubbed the back of his neck. It kept rain off. It did. She tugged the loose thread. For a while. His face colored. Maren set the tarp down. The idea was right. The stitch was wrong. Eli looked up, surprised by the mercy of accuracy. You can learn the stitch, she said. If you want. Hiram Cole made a sound from the stall. Boy ought to want. Eli nodded once. I do. That was the first small shift. Not acceptance. Not trust. Just a handhold. After supper, Jonah cleared the south wall of the barn without making an announcement. He moved broken boxes, a cracked yoke, 2 old barrels, and a pile of scrap lumber that had been waiting so long no one remembered what it was saved for. By lantern light, he dragged a plank table into place. Maren stood in the doorway with her coffee. "This for me?" she asked. "For the work." "That is a careful answer." "It is a true one." She stepped inside and ran her hand over the table. Rough surface. Strong legs. Good height if a block was placed beneath the left side. "It will do. I can smooth it tomorrow. I can work on rough wood." "I know," Jonah said. "But you should not have to." She looked at him then. There was no softness in his face. Just exhaustion. Weather. And a kind of plain effort that did not know how to dress itself up. Outside, the wind pushed against the barn boards. Inside, the lantern made the tools shine dull and steady. 2 days later, the first repaired wagon cover went back on the freight wagon. The seam was reinforced with black waxed thread and sealed clean. Hiram Cole tested it with both hands, pulling harder than necessary. It held. He looked at Maren. "That'll see weather." "It should." "That means yes." Ely muttered. Hiram ignored him. "Good work." By evening, the whole ranch knew. No one said much about it. But when a cracked saddle strap appeared on Maren's table the next morning, it had been cleaned first. When a grain sack came in after that, someone had brushed the flour dust from around the tier. Respect did not arrive with a speech. It arrived as a thing placed carefully where her hands could reach it. On the 4th day, a settler wagon stopped at the gate. The family had come off the north road with a torn cover flapping over their bedrolls. The man looked first at Jonah, then at Maren, then back at Jonah. "You got someone here does canvas repair." Jonah did not answer for her. Maren walked out, opened the torn edge, and checked the weave. 2 hours. She said. "If you want the quick fix. Half a day if you want it to last." "How much?" She named the price. The man hesitated. His wife looked at the stitch on Jonah's freight wagon, then at Maren's hands. "Pay her," she said. Maren took the work. From the barn doorway, Jonah watched the first outside money change hands at Vale Draw. Far off, beyond the low rise toward Borden Creek, Ezra Kline's store sign stood where every supply wagon had to pass. And by sundown, a rider heading that way had seen enough to carry news. The railroad camp came in October, and Borden Creek changed its posture overnight. Men who had spent years talking about the line as if it were weather or politics now stood in front of the general store counting opportunity by wagon load. Stakes appeared 2 miles south of town. Then grading crews. Then supply wagons. Tents. Mule teams. Iron rails stacked near the road. And a mess line long enough to make the valley look less empty than it had in years. Ezra Kline was the first man to paint a new sign. Railroad supplies. Canvas. Hardware. Tools. He put it in his front window before the second crew wagon had settled its wheels. Maren saw the camp 3 days later from the seat of Jonah's wagon. She did not speak for a long while. Jonah glanced at her. "You're thinking. I am counting. That is worse." She looked past the road at the rows of white tents snapping in the wind. "Those tents will need treatment before snow. The supply tarps are staked wrong. That wagon line has at least 3 covers pulling at the crown seam. And every harness in that mule string is going to wear twice as fast in grading work." Jonah followed her gaze but did not pretend to see what she saw. "How much work?" he asked. "Enough to matter." The camp foreman was a square-shouldered man named Caleb Sykes, with a gray beard clipped close and a face that had spent too many seasons measuring men by whether they cost time or saved it. He met them beside the supply tent, where 2 crew hands were arguing over a cracked single tree. Jonah stepped forward. "Mr. Sykes. Jonah Vale. From Vale Draw. This is Maren Rowan." Sykes looked at Jonah first. Then Maren. "What can I do for you?" "I do canvas and leather repair," Maren said. "Wagon covers. Tarps. Tents. Harness. I would like to inspect your damaged equipment and offer repair rates. One of the crew hands smirked. Sykes did not. He looked at the tool roll under her arm. You worked camp equipment before. Not railroad camp. Freight canvas. Sailcloth. Ranch and settler gear. 11 years of it. That is not the same scale. No. Maren said. That is why I am asking to inspect before I name terms. Sykes studied her another second. Then he pointed toward the equipment line. Walk. Maren walked. She did not touch anything at first. She looked. At seams, stakes. Grommets. Cracked leather. Water stains. Stress lines. Men moved around her. Some curious. Some amused. One or two openly doubtful. At the third supply wagon. She stopped. That girth strap is cracked through the second layer. She said. The mule handler frowned. Used it this morning. You were lucky this morning. Sykes bent and checked the strap himself. His expression changed by less than an inch. Maren pointed toward the north stockpile. Those tarps will lose grommets in a hard wind. The stake angle is wrong. That mess tent needs retreatment along the west face. The seam is not leaking yet. But it will. The smirking hand was no longer smirking. Sykes turned to Jonah. She always this plain. Jonah kept his hands at his sides. When the thing is plain. Sykes looked back at Maren. Bring me rates Monday. 1 month trial. Jobs over $5 need estimate first. You answer to my supply man. Bramwell. I will need space to work when I am on site. You'll get a corner of the supply tent. And written record of what comes in and what leaves. Sykes gave a short nod. Good. I like paper that keeps men honest. On the ride back. Jonah did not congratulate her. She was grateful for that. Congratulations too early could sour a thing before it stood. But he said. You will need help. Yes. Eli. He is fast. If he listens. That is a large if. I know. Who else? Maren looked toward the north road. Nora Pike. Jonah frowned. Homestead woman. She has good hands. She brought a tarp last week and knew where the stress line was before her husband did. Her husband may not like it. Her husband is not the one I am hiring. Jonah gave a quiet breath that might have been approval. By Monday. Maren had the rate sheet written clean. By Wednesday. Eli Tabor was working beside her at the south wall. By the next week. Nora Pike arrived before sunrise with a shawl tight around her shoulders and a look on her face that said she expected no kindness and would accept no charity. Maren handed her a needle. Show me a straight pull stitch. Nora did. Slow. But clean. You can learn. Maren said. I know. Nora answered. That was enough. The first weeks at camp were hard. Wind never stopped moving through the supply tent. Men stepped too close until Bramwell learned to keep them back. Eli worked fast and had to be corrected often. Nora worked slow and almost never twice for the same mistake. Jonah hauled them there and back, when ranch work allowed. He did not bargain for Maren. He did not explain her. When Sykes asked a question, Jonah looked at her and waited. That became its own kind of answer. Then the first trouble came. A camp tarp failed in a night wind. Ripping loose from 2 grommets and soaking a stack of rail spikes. By morning. Men were saying the woman from Vale Draw had stitched it. Maren stood over the torn tarp in the supply tent while Sykes, Bramwell, and half the camp watched. She touched the seam. Then the thread. This is not mine. She said. A crew hand snorted. Thread's thread. Maren pulled a length from her pocket. Black, and waxed. Heavy enough to bite into the fingers. Then she lifted the failed seam. This is light cotton dressed with lampblack. It looks dark from 10 feet away. It gives underload. Sykes's eyes narrowed. Who repaired it? He asked. No one answered. Maren looked toward the road to Borden Creek. She knew before anyone said the name. Ezra Kline had not come to the camp. He had only sent thread that would fail where everyone could see it. Maren Rowan laid 2 pieces of thread on Caleb Sykes's supply table. One black. One almost black. To most men in the railroad camp. They looked the same. That was the trick of it. The bad thread had been darkened with lampblack, rubbed deep enough to fool the eye from a few steps away. But under the hard light coming through the tent flap, the difference showed. Maren took the bad thread between both hands and pulled. It snapped. Then she took her own waxed thread, wrapped it once around her palms, and pulled until the skin whitened across her knuckles. It held. The camp went quiet. Not silent. A railroad camp never went silent. Somewhere outside, hammers struck iron. Mules pulled against traces. Men called across the grading line. But inside the supply tent, the kind of quiet that mattered had settled over the table. Bramwell, the supply man, bent closer. That tarp came in marked as your work, he said. It was marked wrong. A crew hand near the back shifted his weight. Maybe she used cheaper thread that day. Maren looked at him. I keep a repair ledger. She opened the book and turned it toward Sykes. Every job was listed. Date. Item. Condition received. Material used. Stitch type. Person who delivered it. Person who collected it. The failed tarp had no entry under her hand. Sykes read long enough for the men around him to grow uncomfortable. Bramwell, he said. Bring me the purchase slip for that thread. Bramwell left and returned with a folded invoice. The supplier's name sat at the bottom. Kline Hardware, Mercantile. No one said Ezra Kline's name out loud. They did not need to. Sykes folded the slip and put it in his coat. This camp will not use that thread again. Maren closed her ledger. The tarp can be repaired properly, but the soaked spikes should be checked for rust before they're stacked back under cover. Sykes looked at her. Most people would have taken victory and walked out. Maren saw the next problem. That was why he nodded. Do it? By noon, the failed tarp was on her table. Eli Tabor helped spread it flat. Nora Pike cut out the bad grommet edges. Slow and exact. Men who had joked 2 days before now stepped around the workspace with new caution. The rumor did not die all at once. It changed shape. By evening, it had moved from her work, failed to Kline, sold bad thread. By the next morning, Borden Creek had heard both versions and was deciding which one cost less to believe. Ezra Kline made the decision harder. He arrived at Vale Draw 3 days later in a black town coat with a lawyer beside him and a leather document case on the seat of his wagon. Jonah met him at the gate. Maren stood at the barn workbench with a saddle skirt under her hands. But she stopped stitching when she saw the case. Kline smiled as if he had come to discuss church repairs. Vale, he said. Miss Rowan. Jonah did not return the smile. State your business. The lawyer climbed down. He was thin, young, and careful with his cuffs. My name is Bramwell, he said. Maren looked up sharply. Not Railroad Bramwell. A cousin. Maybe. Or just the sort of coincidence small towns used when they wanted to feel smaller. The lawyer opened the case and removed a folded note. Ezra looked at Jonah with something like pity dressed as manners. Your father signed this mortgage extension 9 years ago. Kline said. Dutch Vale owed my late partner $840 against this land. The note passed to me when I bought out the account. Jonah's face changed. Not much. Enough. Maren saw it and felt the ground shift. Kline continued. I did not press it before. Out of respect for your family. But debts do not vanish because a man avoids reading old papers. The lawyer handed Jonah the notice. Payment due in 60 days. He said. Principal and interest. Or the secured property becomes subject to claim. The wind moved through the barn, lifting the edge of a canvas sheet. No one spoke. The ranch hands had gathered without being called. Hiram Cole near the corral. Eli by the barn door. Nora Pike with thread still looped around one wrist. Jonah read the paper once. Then again. This is my debt, he said quietly. Maren heard the words like a door closing. My debt. Not yours. Not the ranches. Not the thing we are all standing inside. Mine. Kline's eyes moved to her for half a second. He had heard it too. Maren set down the saddle skirt. Jonah looked at her then. And maybe he understood too late what he had said. Kline. Jonah said. You waited until the railroad account pulled away from your store. Ezra's smile thinned. I waited until the note came due. That note is 9 years old. And still signed. The lawyer cleared his throat. The notice is proper. Kline tipped his hat. First to Jonah. Then with colder courtesy to Maren. 60 days. He said. Winter comes fast in Wyoming. I would not spend too much of it sowing. He rode out with a lawyer beside him. After the wagon disappeared beyond the rise. The ranch stayed still. Jonah folded the notice carefully. Too carefully. I can sell cattle. He said. Maren looked at him. After the season. If I have to. That will gut your herd before winter. My father's note. My land. There it was again. Maren picked up her needle. Not because she could work. But because her hands needed something honest to hold. I see. Jonah stepped closer. That is not what I meant. It is what you said. Maren. I am not a hired woman stitching my way toward permission to stay. His face tightened. No one said you were. You do not have to say a thing plainly for it to stand in the room. Hiram Cole looked away. Eli stared at the dirt. Nora Pike kept her eyes on Maren. That helped more than anyone knew. Be dusk. Maren had moved her ledger. Tool roll. And the railroad repair records into the small tack room off the barn. Not out of the ranch. Not yet. But out of the space where Jonah's debt had swallowed her work without asking. Near midnight. She sat under a lantern and added columns until the numbers blurred. Settler traffic would die by winter. The camp contract might slow. 60 days was a short rope. Then she saw it. The railroad equipment would not disappear when the grading crew moved on. It would sit in Laramie storage through snow. Canvas stacked. Harness dried. Tarps stiffening in cold sheds until spring ruined what winter had not. Maren turned to a clean page. Winter maintenance. Laramie yard. Inspection. Treatment. Repair. Crew required. Advance payment possible. Outside. The barn roof clicked in the cold wind. Jonah's note could take Vale Draw. Unless the broken season itself became work. The next morning. Maren Rowan asked Jonah Vale for the wagon before he could apologize again. He stood in the barn doorway with his hat in both hands and the mortgage notice folded in his coat pocket. He had been carrying it there since Ezra Kline left. As if keeping the paper close might make it less dangerous. I need to go to Laramie. Maren said. Jonah looked at the ledger under her arm. For what? The railroad storage yard. The grading camp is slowing. I know. That is why the equipment will be stored. Canvas does not stop failing because men stop using it. He looked at her for a long moment. Maren. About what I said? Not now. The words were not sharp. That made them worse. Jonah nodded once. I'll hitch the team. I can drive. I know. He went to the wagon anyway and checked both traces before handing her the reins. Not because she could not. Because bad harness had a way of choosing the worst road to break. Maren noticed. She did not soften. Laramie smelled of coal smoke. Wet boards. And iron. The railroad storage yard sat behind a line of freight sheds. Crowded with stacked tarps. Folded tents. Wagon covers. Harness sets. Canvas tool bags. And weather-stiffened ropes. Winter had already put its hand on the place. Frost clung to the shadow side of the lumber piles. Men moved fast and talked little. Bramwell, the railroad supply man, met Maren at the gate. You're early, he said. For spring. For whatever you came to ask. Maren handed him a written proposal. Inspection. Treatment. Repair. Cataloging. Winter storage maintenance. Payment in 3 parts. Work completed before spring grade reopened. Bramwell read the first page. Then the second. This is a larger operation than the camp work. Yes. You have a crew. I will. That is not the same answer. It is the honest one. He studied her over the paper. How fast can you start? 3 days after approval. How much advance? She named the number. His eyebrows lifted. That is not small. Neither is your loss if half these tarps come out of winter rotten. Bramwell looked past her toward the yard, where 2 men dragged a folded canvas sheet across frozen dirt. You always this direct? No. Maren said. Sometimes I am tired. He almost smiled. Almost. By sundown, she had a trial contract. By midnight, she had a crew list. Eli Tabor agreed before she finished asking. Nora Pike came to Vale Draw the next morning with her work shawl and a look that said any husband's opinion had been left at home where it belonged. 2 Homestead women joined after Nora spoke to them at the North Road Church. One had 3 children and a wagon cover she had patched badly for years. The other had quiet hands and eyes that watched every stitch before copying it. Maren turned the barn into a training floor. No speeches. No encouragement dressed up like pity. She taught them how to test canvas by bend and pull. How to read rot. How to choose thread by load. Not color. How to set a grommet so wind would fight the whole sheet instead of one weak ring. Jonah came in once while 5 women and Eli worked under lantern light. He stopped at the door. Maren looked up. He had a small cloth sack in one hand. Payroll, he said. Her face tightened. From what? Sold 8 head early. That herd is already thin. Yes. Jonah. He set the sack on the edge of the workbench but did not push it toward her. I am not buying your forgiveness, he said. I am keeping the crew paid until Bramwell's first installment clears. The room did not move. Eli stared very hard at a grommet. Nora kept working. But slower. Maren looked at the money. Then at Jonah. This is still your debt? She asked. No. He said. It is our deadline. If you still allow that word. That answer did not fix everything. But it stepped in the right direction. She picked up the cloth sack. I will enter it as ranch operating advance. I figured you would. Not yift. No. Not rescue. No. She nodded once. Then it can stay. Jonah left the barn without taking up more space than he had earned. The winter yard work began 3 days later. Laramie wind cut through coats and found skin anyway. Canvas stiffened under cold hands. Waxed thread had to be warmed before it would pull clean. The crew worked in layers. Breath showing white. Fingers aching. Boots loud on plank floors. Maren kept the ledger. Eli handled standard seams faster than most men could cut them open. Nora became the best grommet hand in the crew. The 2 Homestead women learned inspection marks and began catching flaws before they reached Maren's table. At night, they stayed in a narrow rooming house near the freight sheds. Maren slept badly and counted money worse. The first installment came. Then the second. Ezra Kline's 60 days kept moving toward them. In Borden Creek. Rumor did what winter work could not stop it from doing. Ezra told men at the saloon that Jonah had let a woman gamble the ranch on a needle and a railroad promise. He said Vale Draw would be under new ownership by thaw. But word from Laramie traveled too. Railroad men talked at supply counters. Teamsters carried names faster than mail. The story began to change shape before Ezra could hold it still. Not the woman sewing at Vale Draw. The crew from Vale Draw. That difference mattered. On the 57th day, Bramwell inspected the last storage stack. He walked the rows with Maren. Checking tags. Seams. Oil marks. Grommets. And treatment notes. He tried 3 repairs with both hands and failed to make them move. At the end, he signed the completion invoice. Solid work, he said. Maren took the paper. Her hands did not shake until she was outside. That night, she sat in the rooming house with Jonah's advance. The railroad payments. The camp balance. And every repair dollar counted into straight columns. They were short. $40. She stared at the number until the lamp burned low. The next morning, Jonah arrived from Vale Draw with frost on his coat and a small leather pouch in his hand. Before he spoke, Maren knew. No, she said. He set the pouch on the table. Final cattle money. You sold more. Phew. You should have told me. I am telling you now. Her anger came fast. Then stopped when she saw his face. No pride. No secret rescue. Just a man offering his part of a load he had finally learned not to carry alone. Jonah looked at the ledger. Enter it, however, it truly belongs. Maren opened the book. For a long moment, the pen hovered over the page. Then she wrote, Vale Draw Partnership Contribution. Sishameyuan. Jonah read it. His voice was rough when he said, Partnership. Maren capped the ink. If the word holds through tomorrow. Outside. The morning train whistled over the frozen yard. Ezra Kline would arrive at Vale Draw with an assessor in 2 days. And this time, the ledger would be waiting for him. Ezra Kline came to Vale Draw with a lawyer, a land assessor, and a smile that had already spent the ranch in his mind. The morning was hard with frost. The yard stood pale under a thin winter sun, and every fence rail carried a white edge. Jonah Vale waited near the barn, coat buttoned, hat low, the mortgage notice folded in his breast pocket. Maren Rowan stood beside the workbench. Her ledger lay open in her hands. Behind her, Elitabor, Nora Pike, Hiram Cole, and the rest of the hands stood quiet near the barn wall. No one had been asked to gather. They had simply come out when Kline's wagon rolled through the gate. Kline stepped down slowly. "Morning, Vale," he said. "Miss Rowan." Jonah did not answer. The lawyer opened his document case. The assessor looked over the yard, already measuring property more than people. Kline's gaze moved to the barn, the house, the corral, the south wall workbench, and the repaired wagon covers stacked under shelter. 60 days, he said. "I gave you fair time." Maren stepped forward. "You gave him winter." Kline looked at her with mild amusement. "Winter comes to everyone." "Yes," she said. "Some people work through it." She set the ledger on a crate between them. Then she opened a canvas money pouch and placed the bills beside it. Railroad payments, camp balances, repair money. Jonah's $40 marked in the book as partnership contribution. Every amount entered cleanly. Every receipt folded beneath its line. Kline's smile held for 1 second too long. Then it changed. The lawyer counted first. Then the assessor counted. Then Jonah counted last. Not because he doubted Maren, but because the debt had carried his family name and he needed to see its end with his own eyes. $840. Interest included. Kline's jaw tightened. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The note is satisfied. Mark it," Maren said. The lawyer looked at Kline. Kline did not move. Maren turned the ledger slightly so the assessor could see the last column. The payment was made before witnesses. On secured land. Inside the term of notice. If Mr. Kline refuses receipt, I will ask the assessor to note that refusal. The assessor, who had expected a simple seizure and found arithmetic instead, took off one glove. "I'll witness satisfaction," he said. Kline looked at him sharply. The man did not look away. The lawyer marked the note paid. He signed. The assessor signed. Jonah signed. Then Maren signed as record keeper of the funds. Her name sat on the paper in black ink. Not as wife. Not as hired help. As the woman whose ledger had kept the land from changing hands. Kline took the paper back as if it had become dirty. "This ranch still limps," he said. Jonah looked at the barn roof. The cracked bunkhouse step. The thin cattle in the far pen. "Yes," he said. "But it is standing." Kline turned to Maren. "A winter contract is not a kingdom." "No," she said. "It is work." That answer left him nothing useful to strike. He climbed into his wagon and rode out with less hurry than defeat required and less dignity than he wanted. By afternoon, the assessor filed the release at the land office in Borden Creek. The old mortgage note was stamped, satisfied, and entered into county record. Ezra Kline's claim on Vale Draw did not merely fail in the yard. It ended on paper. A paid debt spoken aloud could still be twisted by rumor. A paid debt written into the land book had a harder time changing shape. Before sundown, Caleb Sykes sent word from the railroad camp. The spring repair account would stay with Maren's crew. The order named the work plainly. Rowan Canvas Repair. Approved for spring inspection and maintenance. Kline's store could still sell nails, lantern oil, and flour. But the railroad canvas orders no longer came through his counter. The change moved through town in practical ways. A teamster asked to see thread weight before buying. A homestead woman carried a torn tarp past Kline's front door and took the north road toward Vale Draw. At the feed counter, Ezra closed his account book harder than he needed to. The sound carried across the store. Not loud enough. Vale Draw still had debts to watch and boards to replace. The barn roof needed proper repair before thaw. The bunkhouse floor had a soft place near the stove. The cattle operation was lean. And Jonah counted every head twice. But the land was no longer under Kline's hand. That changed the way men worked. Eli stopped hiding mistakes and started bringing them to Maren, before they grew costly. Hiram Cole cleaned the old tool rack and hung labels above the pegs. Nora Pike arrived before sunrise on Monday with 2 more women from the North Road Church. Both ready to learn grommets before spring orders came in. Maren paid them from the railroad advance. Not in favors. Not in thanks. In money folded into envelopes with their names written clean across the front. The south wall was no longer just a workbench. It was becoming a shop. One evening, after the first warm wind of March moved through the draw, Jonah carried a cedar board to the barn gate. Maren was oiling harness leather at the workbench when she heard the hammer. She stepped outside. The board was new. Sanded smooth. The letters burned dark and plain. Rowan canvas and Vale stock. Maren stood beneath it for a long while. "You put my name first," she said. Jonah rested the hammer against the gate post. "That is where the canvas work belongs. It is a business name." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back. Steady and tired and more alive than he had been the day the tarp split at the gate. "And whatever else we earn," he said. Maren said nothing for a moment. Then she took the hammer from him and drove the last nail herself. After supper, Jonah placed a new ledger on the kitchen table. The cover was plain brown leather. Bought from Laramie with no decoration except a brass corner piece. Maren opened it. On the first page, Jonah had written only one line. Vale Draw partnership account below it. The page waited. Jonah stood across from her. Hands loose at his sides. "I said it was my debt," he said. Maren looked up. "I was wrong," he continued. "It was my father's paper. My family's trouble. But the ranch stopped being mine alone the day your work started keeping it alive." He pushed nothing toward her. Not the pen. Not the ledger. He only waited. Maren dipped the pen herself. Under the account title, she wrote her name first. Maren Rowan. Then she turned the ledger toward him. Jonah signed beneath it. Inside the house, blue cloth waited on the table for kitchen curtains she had finally decided to make. Outside, the repaired wagon covers hung under the barn eaves, ready for weather. At the south wall, the heavy needle rested beside the old ledger. Both of them worn now by honest use. The ranch did not look new. It looked kept. That was better. At sundown, Maren stood at the barn gate beside Jonah Vale while the cedar boards settled into the evening light. The wind moved over Vale Draw, touched the canvas stacks, passed through the corral, and went on across the Wyoming plain carrying no promise except the work waiting tomorrow. For once, that was enough. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.